Hi, thanks for coming out tonight. My name is Leah. I work at Yucca County Library, organizing events. And thank you for coming to our first installation of our Wyoming Alternative Energy Series. And this is the first event of it. And next week we have Creative Energies presenting on solar. And yet to be scheduled is an event of wind and then electric vehicles. So thanks for joining us. And if you have any questions, please follow us on our newsletter or Facebook or Twitter and Instagram. So we're on that as well. And without further ado, thank you to the Idaho National Laboratory for coming all the way over to speak with us about the future of nuclear energy in Wyoming.
Thank you, yeah, really appreciate it. My name is Todd Allen. I work for the National Laboratory, the lab's director of external engagement and communications. My Facebook and calls and voice. Before we get started, I introduce my colleague on the ground over here. She's the lab's director of state and local government affairs. She's basically our voice in the office. What you'll find here today is, while we came from Idaho National Laboratory, we have a number of affiliations on the panel today, and I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves as they give their presentation. We're really excited to be here. Really thrilled that the library will get to host this. We've been doing some of these panel sessions, and I also it's great to go to Jackson community as well. I would say before we get started, we want to be very informal. Once presentations are done, we want to just have a conversation. So we hope there's questions, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. But hopefully we can make this conversational and largely informal. So I want to begin this session tonight with questions. Want to go?
Sounds like you can hear me okay? Okay, great. Good evening. I'm Ashley Finland. I'm the director of the National Reactor Innovation Center at Idaho National Laboratory. It's a national program that's centered at INL, and I've been here in Idaho for about 3 years. And I actually had the shortest drive over here. I live in Victor, so it was. I guess I love it when we have to Jackson. It's actually closer than work. So thanks for having me and the rest of us here today. Nice to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about advanced nuclear energy demonstrations. The National Reactor Innovation Center is focused on accelerating advanced nuclear demonstrations in partnership with the private sector. And I think probably you're more familiar with the existing nuclear technologies than the advanced ones. So we'll technologies, but just for background, our existing nuclear energy fleet in the United States provides around 15 to 20% of our electricity and more than half of all of our clean energy. So more than all other combined. So we can go ahead to the next slide, Ellie. Thank you. So advanced nuclear is somewhat different. I mean, it builds on today's technology. It builds on technology that's been tested for decades, but is really looking to meet the needs of today's market, meet the needs of society and the needs of the future. So there are a number of different sizes. You might hear about micro reactors or small modular reactors, and then there are medium and large versions as well. And that's because we see different needs moving forward. We want to have technologies that can provide remote power to remote locations, that can provide secure power on military bases or for data centers, as well as things that are sized to replace retiring coal plants, and then the large central station generation as well. We also, so some of the nomenclature can get confusing, and you might just hear about sodium reactors or lead reactors or helium reactors or high temperature gas reactors, and then none of that is particularly important for the discussion today. In my opinion, those are all different fluids. They're different fluids that are used to take heat out of the core to make something useful. But the point is that with those different fluids, you can reach higher temperatures and you can reach higher efficiencies with better economics. You can do things like create hydrogen and district heating and heat for industrial purposes alongside electricity. So those different fluids give you more versatility and more capability. So that's what you're getting out of those. They also have improved safety features, reduced emergency planning zones because their worst case accident has impacts within the boundary, no offsite impacts, and improved waste characteristics in some cases, as well as better security and economics. There are dozens of private sector companies active in this space, so a lot of different projects moving forward. And there are diverse markets. I've mentioned some of them, but we see interest in Alaska, in Puerto Rico, in maritime shipping, in data centers, and in the Department of Defense, as well as traditional markets. Next slide, Ellie. And you can click again. So that was too fast. Can you go back? Thank you. Perfect. So I just wanted to share a little bit of history because some people can maybe get a little discouraged about advanced reactors and whether we can actually do this. It's a big task, but we've actually done this before, and all of us here at Idaho National Laboratory hear about this all the time, because INL used to be the National Reactor Testing Station. It was established in 1949, and over a period of 25 years, the nation demonstrated 52 nuclear reactors out at Idaho National Laboratory. So we were able to innovate and do a lot of firsts and a lot of exciting scientific accomplishments in a short period of time when we were focused on doing that. So if you can click again, Ellie, we're doing it again at Idaho National Lab, and you'll hear more about that and across the country. You'll hear more about that in the coming slides. So you can click again, Ellie, but we're doing it better in a lot of ways. We've learned from some of the past challenges with nuclear energy. And as we look forward, you'll see and hear that the government, the private sector, and the laboratories are taking a new approach. There's a public-private partnership that is at the core of how this is moving forward, and that results in products that are more attuned to society's needs and to the market's needs. Next slide, Ellie. So this is just the Department of Energy's Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program. It's a part of this big public-private partnership. The Department of Energy launched this program a couple of years ago. They awarded 10 different projects. 4 of these are reactor demonstrations. And these are cost-shared demonstrations. So the first 2 on your left are the Tier 1 demonstration projects. The Natrium Reactor, which is planned for Kemmer, Wyoming, and the XE100, which is planned for Washington State. Those represent more than $6 billion of public-private cost-shared investment in these demonstration projects that are targeted to go online in 2028 and 2029. And there are myriad other projects moving forward as well under this program. Next slide, Ellie. Thanks. So this is an INL slide that maps out a number of the key projects that Idaho National Lab is involved in. And I'm not going to run through each of these, but these are reactor demonstration projects. And the big message here is that likely not all of these will be completed. That's just how startups work and how technology demonstrations work. But with this many projects on the map, we have a lot of shots on goal and a lot of opportunities to succeed in commercializing advanced nuclear. And from our perspective at INL, each of these represents a project with a very credible path to completion. Next slide, please, Billy. So INL provides comprehensive support to innovators. We have worked for decades on some of the fuel that provides the foundation of many of these technologies. It's an advanced fuel that helps us achieve new capabilities, as well as advanced test reactor modeling and simulation capability, a lot of analysis of irradiated materials and things. So just immense capabilities at Idaho National Laboratory, just over the mountains, that enable us to really test these advanced technologies, to let the innovators come in and test their fuel to failure and then see what happens. Or test it throughout any foreseeable operating conditions and see whether it would or would not fail. And that's all really important to being able to assure ourselves that what we expect to happen, really does happen when you test things to failure. Next slide. One more thing that I'm excited about is the National Reactor Innovation Center has demonstration test beds that we're standing up so that innovators can come and actually demonstrate microreactors, so small advanced reactors, inside these facilities at Idaho National Laboratory. So up here you can see in the top right, there's a shiny dome. And then over on the left-hand side, you can see the exterior of part of INL and then the interior of a cell. So these are two different buildings that previously hosted reactor demonstrations. They now sit empty, and we're preparing them to host demonstration reactors again. Very small ones, but what it gives us is this containment and defense in depth to allow us to do these initial startups in a very controlled environment, and also alongside all of those experimental capabilities that we can use to test how things performed. Next slide, please. Another key area is decreasing costs and serving future markets. So we have some public-private cost-shared partnerships where we're developing advanced construction technologies. So you might have, probably everybody has heard of nuclear projects that have gone way over budget and behind schedule. Yeah, this bias, thank you. So that's problematic. But a lot of study has been done on those projects, and it turns out, not surprisingly really, that the problems are not with the core technology or any of the fancy nuclear stuff. The problems are with the concrete and the steel and the civil construction. So it turns out that we can do better. And in fact, technologies exist for modular construction of concrete and steel and much more efficient excavation in other parts of the construction world. They haven't been applied to nuclear. So we're applying them to nuclear in an R&D environment so that they can be used in a commercial environment to improve those cost outcomes. We're also doing a lot of work at Idaho National Lab on integrated energy systems. And you'll hear from Todd Allen on that a little bit as well. But that's really about seeing how nuclear can balance renewables and other sources so that we can actually use nuclear to get more wind and solar by supporting it with nuclear that can ramp up and down, or that can store energy in another storage form. It could be molten salt, it could be batteries, or other things. Next slide, please. We're working hard on proactive impact management. So as we look at advanced reactors, they'll have advanced fuel forms and byproducts that are not the same as today's reactors. So Josh Cheryl is the last speaker here, and he's going to speak more to that. He's an expert in that, and his team has been working with us on identifying exactly how we're going to package and store some of these materials. Next slide, please. And then in engagement, so advanced nuclear doesn't have a reputation for doing public engagement very well. So our hope is that as we move forward with advanced nuclear technology, we're also going to do much better in engagement, in having two-way conversations, in looking at social justice and environmental justice aspects of citing. And actually, we're taking the opportunity with advanced reactors to be able to do important work in social sciences that can help us with environmental justice aspects of things. And Todd's organization, his students and professors are doing a lot of work in that area. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to highlight two of those because especially one of them's in Wyoming. So there are two Nuclear Energy University Program Awards that my organization helped to get started. And the first one here is Engaging Wyoming Communities in an Environmental Justice Approach for Advanced Nuclear Energy Facilities Citing. That's a partnership led by the University of Wyoming. And these are grants that come out of the DOE for universities in partnership with programs like ours. And they're working on this environmental justice approach in coordination with the Natrium Project in Kemmer. And then the Environmental Justice and Equity Framework for Citing Nuclear Energy in America's Arctic is at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And they are looking at similar issues, but for Alaskan applications. So I want to say a little bit about what I see as the opportunities for Wyoming in this. And a lot of it is leadership. So Wyoming has this opportunity to lead in advanced nuclear in general, in advanced nuclear as it pertains to repowering coal communities, and in some of this work, really looking at environmental justice aspects of advanced nuclear. So there's a lot of leadership happening in Wyoming right now that I'm excited about. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of communities in transition around the country, particularly where coal plants are retiring, and Wyoming is one example of this, where we see this. And John might want to comment more on this later. We've been really involved in regional work at INL. But you can go to the next slide, Ellie. So this is the Natrium plant. And so in Kemmer, Wyoming, there's a retiring coal plant. There's also a coal mine there. And the Natrium Project, which is a partnership between TerraPower and GE Hitachi and the Department of Energy through this advanced reactor demonstration program. They looked at 4 different sites around Wyoming, all retiring coal plants, to work to select a site for their demonstration reactor. It turned out that Kemmer was their choice for siting that first reactor. And actually all 4 sites really wanted to have this reactor at their town, at their retiring coal plant. And Kemmer won. The TerraPower Company and Pacific Corp now have a project to look at the next 5 sites. So they're reconsidering some of those other sites as well as others in Wyoming and Utah. But this is just an image of the Natrium Project. We don't need to go into detail on it, but I'm going to show you something on the next slide. And Ellie, you can go to the next slide. So one of the interesting things about the Natrium Project is that it splits the nuclear island and the power island. And that's not unique, but something that they've done is they're taking the nuclear energy and they're putting it into a molten salt thermal storage system. And from that, they're going to have more dispatchable energy. So it's a 345 megawatt plant, but it can ramp up to 550 megawatts for a period of time in order to accommodate the changing loads during the day or changing output from renewable energy, or whatever the users need. And that's one of the interesting aspects of the Natrium Project. These are TerraPower's images. INL is a partner on the Natrium Project. We have a lot of work on their fuel at INL. We're testing it, irradiating it, putting it in our reactor to see how it performs, and then verifying its performance to send to the regulator for the Natrium Project's licensing case. But to be clear, I don't represent Natrium or TerraPower. We're just partners. So this is the project that's planned to go into Kemmer, and it's pretty exciting. They're planning to start construction in the spring as soon as the ground thaws, which I told them might be summer, but we'll see, on their sodium fill station. And they're planning to get their construction license into the nuclear regulator at the end of 2023. So it's moving forward well. And I think, Ellie, I don't know if I have another slide or not. Oh, okay, yeah. So just a little bit more on coal transitions. These are coal plants in the lower 48. There are a number in Wyoming, as I'm sure you're aware. But this is part of that leadership opportunity for Wyoming. You can see that these transitions are going to be happening across the country. Coal plants that will eventually retire. And Ellie, you can go to the next slide. So nearly 100 gigawatts are going to retire from 2020 to 2030, nearly 50% of the coal fleet. That's the scheduled retirements based on how old they are. So again, enormous opportunity to lead on an early project, of which there may be many more. Next slide, Ellie. And that is it. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share this. I'm happy to take questions later, but I can pass it back to you, John.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Ashley, for that. I'm going to turn it now over to Todd Allen.
All right, thanks. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to come listen to me. My name is Todd Allen. I am the chair of the Nuclear Engineering and Radiological Sciences Department at the University of Michigan, which happens to be the #1 ranked department in the country, not to brag. If it seems like I get flustered during the presentation, it's because this owl is staring at me and it doesn't blink. It's like a CIA interrogator. I thought what I'd do is just help give you a little context. Well, first, a little bit about me. I've been the chair of that department for the last 4 years, but over my career, I've spent some time as an academic at the University of Michigan and the University of Wisconsin. I've worked at the National Lab 2 different times out here in Idaho, once early in my career as a staff scientist, and then the second time as the deputy lab director, so more of a senior executive. And I started out my career as a Navy nuke submarine officer. That's where I learned to run reactors in the Navy. So, but I thought to build a little bit on what Ashley told you, I just want to give you a little context on the history of nuclear and why we're in such a potentially pivotal moment. Okay, So if you go back to the history of commercial nuclear, we've only ever built one generation of commercial nuclear plants, right? So we're on version 1. Started sort of robustly in the 1960s. And for a few decades, we were building a lot of plants, right? About 30 plants per decade. It was actually said we got up to about 20% of the US electricity. And it's been around there ever since. Right? Single type of product, very, very large, usually custom built on-site power plants. And we incentivized. So in the 1960s, everyone was under a regulated utility and you got reimbursed based on the size of the plant you built, right? So we purposefully built very large plants. Okay? But it plateaued off at 20%. And you ask yourself, well, why? Why does it plateau at all? And like any product anywhere, it plateaus because it's some combination of what the technology does, like how much of it can you use, what's it cost, right? How much is it accepted or desired by society? And are we doing anything in public policy to influence whether we use it or not? Right. And so we got to a point where that's about as many very large plants as we wanted or needed. Well, in the subsequent 20 years, lots of things have changed. We've changed energy markets. Prices of renewables have dropped tremendously, making them much more affordable than I would have imagined, right, as a young college student. Right? They operate differently, right? As Ashley mentioned, they come on and off the grid, right? Fuel is free, but it's free when it's available. So you have to adjust your system to having things come on and off, right? In some ways, that makes the first generation nuclear power plants not as appropriate, right? We still probably can use some, right? But there are lots of situations now where you might have an opportunity to deploy a nuclear power plant, but it's different. It's different in the size and the technology and the things you want to use it for, right? And so when we talk about advanced reactors and the different possibilities, the reason I think why so many private companies are interested in this moment is there are opportunities that didn't exist, right? And they're just trying to see where they'll fit in, right? And I think when communities choose, right, what they want, it's a combination of what does the technology do? And they want it to be cleaner, right? We continuously, if I didn't bring any slides, but if you look just over the history of mankind, we continue to drive towards lower carbon systems, right? Without any specific drivers, right? We go from like whale blubber and wood to coal to natural gas, right? I mean, we're doing that. So that's a driver, right? We always want cleaner. We always want affordable, right? We don't want things that cost too much, right? Because energy makes our lives better. We want them to be reliable and resilient, right? We want them on when we want them. And if they do go away, we want them to come back quickly. And I think Ashley mentioned this even more so recently, we're paying more attention to the equity issues, right? How are the costs and benefits used and distributed in using energy, right? And that's where you get to the energy justice concepts. And so I think that's the moment we're in, right? It's this question of you've got lots of different options for your energy. Each one does some things well, right? Each one has some drawbacks, and glad to talk about any of that with you, right? But in the end, we're at a point where we're trying to decide what do we transition to, and in what cases do certain products make more sense. And it's not going to be the same in every place in the country, right? Depending on your local resources, your local community values, you may make different choices, right? And so Ashley mentioned the program at University of Michigan. I started a program called Fastest Path to Zero, zero meaning zero carbon. So we're doing. We're trying to look at the combinations of technology, at what cost, and social acceptance, and what policy drivers will help you get to zero carbon as fast as you can, while ensuring that it's affordable, resilient, and equitable. Right? And Ashley mentioned a couple of things we're working on, but it's questions of community engagement and what's the right combination of technical and social to make products sellable in the market, right? And we're working on some citing tools to help people look at data, right? The first versions we built were sort of from the perspective of a developer, right? Where might they want to go look, right? What might be a place that would want to build their product? And we're about to start another version that's more from the community perspective, right? What things do you need to think about as a community, right? In making energy choices. So that's just a quick background about me and what I think is going on in power and nuclear in general. And as Ashley said, we're glad to answer any of your questions the rest of the evening, and then I'll turn it back to Joe.
Thank you so much, Todd. I really appreciate it. And now the final panelist will go with, at least to start, as a colleague of mine from Idaho National Laboratory, Josh Cheryl.
All right. All right, can you hear me okay? Well, yeah, so I'm Josh Cheryl. I work at Idaho National Lab. I am currently a technical advisor looking at ways for these advanced reactor companies to get the fuel that they need to fuel their advanced reactors. But for the previous 10 years, I've been focused on the back end and the spent fuel and nuclear waste from the commercial industry, and then how that one generation of nuclear plants that we have, how that transitions to the next wave, and how do we make sure that the back end and the nuclear waste is properly thought of at inception. This goes back to what I actually was talking about, making sure that as we deploy and demonstrate these reactors, we're also making sure that we're not making mistakes in the back end with this nuclear waste, and we're properly managing it. So that's sort of my expertise, and I wanted to maybe just set the stage on what we do with our nuclear waste, what it is, and so that if questions come up, we can kind of all be on the same page. So as has been discussed, about 20% of electricity comes from nuclear power. Nuclear power is very energy dense, so very small amounts of material can generate very large amounts of energy, which is one of the reasons that nuclear fuel is so interesting and has been shown to really work in some areas. And because of that, you have very small amounts of nuclear waste as it compares to the actual electricity that is generated. So at all the nuclear plants currently, we currently have the nuclear fuel, the spent nuclear fuel, still at those sites. It's safely being managed either in pools, they call that wet storage, or in sealed dry storage, so that the fuel has cooled off to the point it can be safely managed, not into the pools. And we've been doing this for 50 to 60 years. At INL, we have continued to do research into both the spent fuel, as well as the most effective containers to store it, ways to cool it off, those sort of things. And so we've been doing that very successfully across the US for many decades. And fortunately, because of all the reactors that have been deployed at Idaho National Lab, I think it was 52 that was discussed, we have a long history of managing different sort of fuels. And so all of these advanced fuels are generally different than the current fleet that we're currently managing. And because they're different, we need to make sure that we understand them, that we can properly store them and keep them safe for the public as well as the workers at those plants. And so we have at INL a huge resource portfolio of making sure that all this material is safely managed and will be for the foreseeable future. So that's generally just kind of an overview of what spent fuel management looks like, and happy to sort of have a dialogue on those sort of topics.
Thanks, Josh. I really appreciate it. I'm going to get started here with just a question or two from me, and then we'll go up to the audience and see what's on all your minds. So first thing I wanted to ask, we've talked a little bit about what's going on here in the United States and here regionally. And if you want to speak a little bit to what's going on with nuclear international, what the globe is looking at, what the dynamics across the globe.
So I'll give it a start, and like many things, it's different in different regions, right? I think that in the last 2-3 years, but really accelerating with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there is an ever increasing interest in at least thinking about nuclear energy as an option, right? There are some countries around the world that have adopted nuclear, right? France is a good example. Sweden, Finland, right? Whatever historical reasons, they've used the technology. Right next door to France, Germany, they've chosen to get rid of it. One of the things that's happened, I think, in the past, let's say 10 years, people are much more attuned to climate change and what it will take to go to zero carbon systems. In some cases, I think that's driving interest in at least going back and taking a look at nuclear, and does this next generation of nuclear make sense for them? I think the Russian invasion brings up big questions about energy security, right? A lot of countries in Europe were quite dependent on Russian supplied fossil fuels. this is now at risk. And so I've got a set of slides I prepared for other talks, and it's just newspaper headlines. Belgium slows down on their phasing out of nuclear power. Germany slows down. Sweden speeds up. Netherlands speeds up, right? So they're all in the last few years moving in the direction of possibly more. And even in countries where you might be surprised, right? Japan, after the Fukushima incident, we're very strongly trying to move or limit their use of nuclear energy. But Japan's an island, right? They've got energy security issues. They can't connect to the grid, right? And I think as time has gone on and the price of fossil fuels is rising so much, they're having to go back and take another look, right? So I would say right now, what people are looking at, whether it's large reactors, I mentioned we're not building a lot of large reactors in the US. China's building a lot. They've got a huge energy demand. That makes sense for them. Other parts of the world, they'll look at different systems. But I think in general, right, compared to maybe 10 years ago, there's just a lot more either enthusiasm or at least cautiously examining the possible use of it.
I'll just add a little bit to that. I agree with everything that Todd said. It's a very, energy geopolitics are an important priority for the United States and the world, and nuclear energy is particularly interesting from a geopolitical perspective because it tends to come along with 100-year relationship. You have a plant that you spend some time planning, building, it operates for potentially 80 or even 100 years, and then you're decommissioning, and throughout that, the vendor country is providing probably fuel, certainly expertise, a lot of engagement. And we see that energy security issue now for countries that are customers of Russia. And it has been the case that Russia has dominated the international nuclear energy market. They've had 46% of nuclear technology agreements, and the United States has had something like 12% recently. Very, very big dominance from Russia and enormous moving out from China, where China is marketing their plants all over the world. We do now see this reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with many countries who were planning to have Russia build their nuclear power plants now saying, well, okay, we want to give the US a second look. And the reality is that Russia and China both pair financing with their nuclear plants in ways that we're not able to, because we don't have a government supported nuclear energy industry. And that has been a challenge for US companies to compete internationally. But this recognition of the risk of working with Russia is changing that picture. And so there's a lot of interest, particularly across the world, but also especially in Eastern Europe. So Poland has just announced some deals with NuScale, which is a US company. And then so my 7 a.m. tomorrow is a remote meeting with a delegation from Ukraine who are talking to Idaho National Laboratory to learn about our nuclear work and nuclear safety. And coming up in January, we have an on-site meeting with Romania. So just really an increased interest that I think is very exciting for the United States.
Yeah, and if I can add one more thing, in addition to countries looking at their own energy security, another advantage I think the US has is all the advanced reactor types that Ashley mentioned. We are actually ahead in the design and building of those, right? So I'm going to keep saying we're sort of at a unique point in time, right? That's another reason why, like, we are ahead and we have an opportunity to establish those relations, maybe establish those markets. But to Ashley's point about the Chinese, they're very aggressive, and they're very good at sort of catching up quickly, right? So.
And maybe following up on Josh.
Well, I was just going to maybe just add on there a little bit. I think there's really an opportunity, I think it was brought up, for the US really to sort of lead again in the nuclear space. We 50, 60 years ago, the US was the lead in this space. And with the invasion by Russia, it's really opened everybody's eyes about the limitations of energy security. So it's an opportunity for us to sort of reestablish leadership in the advanced reactor space. But also you're going to see additional investment domestically in nuclear fuels and technologies, really to really drive us to a place where we can not only domestically be very comfortable with our energy, but also be able to export it and help others.
Thanks, Josh, on that. I'll do, one two-part question here, and then again, like I promised, we'll go out to the audience and see. Can you give us a sense of how many companies are out there that are developing reactor systems? And then what kind of projects are attracting investors? Fair question.
So I don't remember the exact number, but it's certainly dozens. I mean, it has been in the realm of 60 companies pursuing advanced reactors. Todd may know the exact number, so I'll give it to him next. And then the types of companies that are getting investments. So advanced nuclear is getting investments at different stages. There are venture investors in very small startup companies, and we're seeing those in advanced nuclear companies that are developing nuclear power for space applications, as well as for defense applications and microreactor terrestrial applications for the most part. And then we're seeing some of the special acquisition, types of deals. I think those are going by the wayside, but there have been some of those. And then increasingly, we're seeing some strategic partnerships. So companies like, what's the big chemical company that Dow, making strategic investments, and Shell is now starting to do nuclear, not execute nuclear projects, but plan nuclear R&D type projects. So we're seeing big oil, big chemical start to make strategic investments in nuclear as they look out to the future and understand how they can decarbonize and meet their production goals and their reliability needs with nuclear energy. And we're not seeing banks yet, right? We're not seeing bank investors in nuclear yet. We'll get there. What do you want to add, Todd?
Yeah, I'd just say, I think the number is probably around 50, but that number includes some fusion companies. And if you don't know the difference between fission and fusion, we can talk about that too. But the point is, compared to 10 years ago, when it was close to zero, there's a huge acceleration in the amount of private interest in advanced nuclear. And I think without even needing to know company names and things, I think what's critical is it's different business opportunities, right? So the Dow's a good example. Why would Dow be interested? Dow uses a lot of high temperature heat, all right? If they are serious about decarbonizing, they either have to figure out how to sequester carbon from using fossil fuels or use nuclear. And those are the likely paths, because it's very inefficient to go from sunlight to battery, back to electricity to heat. I mean, you just waste a lot along that pathway. And Dow is a huge user of energy. So that's an example where nuclear may make a lot more sense to that company. If you look at vehicles, right, a lot of momentum towards electric vehicles. And for your sedan, I get it. Heavy duty trucking is different, right? The batteries necessary to do that, it's a lot of weight to carry around. It may make more sense for them to use hydrogen fuel cells. Where's hydrogen come from? Well, there's lots of it, but not by itself. You have to separate it from water. That takes energy. You want to do that with something that doesn't create carbon dioxide. All right, so it's a long story to go around about all the different companies and the different business applications that they're looking at. How do you power all the charging stations that are going to go along the highway, right? If everyone's going to use electric vehicles. And I think that's where people are starting to make these financial investments. And like Ashley said at the beginning, they all won't make it, right? But likely some of them will, because in a system that drives to zero carbon, they'll make sense.
Okay, thank you, Todd. So with that, any questions of the audience? We can address. Sure.
I got a long list of questions, but I will. So like, that's one thing we hear certainly used about Natrium is that their fuel needed to be supplied by Russia. And so I was wondering if you could discuss that, if they're finding alternatives, and what is so unique about their fuel source that they're trying to find now an alternative to Russia.
Sure, I'll start and we'll see who wants to add in. So the difference for these different reactors, generally for the fuel, is that the enrichment of uranium-235 is higher for this material. So U-235, uranium atom, and it is what you need to create the power to create the fission. Our current reactors have about 5% enrichment. These reactors are going to have 15 to 20% enrichment. And so we domestically do not have a commercial scale ability to enrich the material from 5% up to 15 or 20%. And the intent for Natrium was to get this material, I believe, from Russia. Now, we in the US are now, and this goes back to the earlier comment, are looking to invest in making sure that we have domestic supplies of this material to support all potentially, again, it's not going to be all of these plants, but it could be a lot of these plants, and they all have a newer fuel type. I mean, again, we have limited experience with these fuels at smaller scale, but when you start looking at 1, 5, 10, 50 of these nuclear plants, there's a lot of fuel. There's a whole supply chain around it. And so Natrium, the key there is that enrichment level. That's a challenge. We do have some material, and again, we have experience with some fuel. Specifically, we have some material at Idaho National Lab, which actually we're trying to recover that fuel and use and provide to some of these advanced reactor companies to sort of bridge the gap until we can get a large scale commercial enrichment capability.
How long that may delay the Kimberley plant?
So we actually have, say I talk about INL, there are several different fuel sources potentially that could be used for the Natrium plant. We are, INL is in conversations with these companies looking at solutions so that the fuel doesn't delay the plant. And right now, we think there may be some alternatives. Again, everybody's sort of scrambling with the Russian invasion to figure out where we can get these fuels from. But again, the uniqueness is that enrichment level. The form is also a little different than the current fuel that we have. But we do have some stockpiles of materials across the US that may be suitable for Natrium and other advanced reactors.
So NuScale had the same problem?
No, so NuScale did not. NuScale used sort of the traditional light water reactor fuel that is enriched only to about 5%. The Natrium reactor, it needs higher enriched material.
I'll just add 2 points to that. One is that there's no inherent reason that we can't make this fuel in the US. Maybe that was totally clear. It happens that Russia already makes it. We don't already make it, but we need a demand signal in order to create the industrial supply chain. Once we have it and we can get it, but that's always a chicken and egg problem. So there have been $700 million invested in this issue through the IRA, and there's going to continue to be continued discussion in Congress on how to address this issue for Natrium and the other first movers. So I think that go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, just clarifying that. So the IRA is the Inflation Reduction Act. It was just passed. There's $700 million basically set aside for this fuel source, which is what they call it high assay, low enriched uranium. You may hear the term HALEU. And so there was, as Ashley mentioned, 700 million, and we would expect additional investments. The Senate, Congress, everybody, they realize that this is a huge issue. So I would expect additional investments domestically to meet the demand. And it's a challenge because again, there was a plan on the table. They thought it was sort of solved. Now we are trying to make the best of the situation. But it's the same thing. This is a potentially, multi-billion-dollar industry, and you need, before somebody's going to invest billions of dollars, you need some confidence that they're going to get a return on the investment to generate the fuel. And so the federal government sort of is trying to position itself to, again, bridge the gap and incentivize investments so that we do have a consistent source of this material for Natrium and other reactors going forward.
Yeah, just a small point out something Josh said. And I just want to point out, if you haven't noticed this yet, he's talking about Congress appropriating hundreds of millions of dollars. Nuclear energy is an amazingly bipartisan supported issue in the federal government. Bipartisan, bicameral for about the past 10 years. The federal government has really gotten behind these technologies in a way that if you were me 20 years ago, you'd be surprised. It's quite amazing.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So I'll start with a full disclosure that I'm a Wyoming state legislator. And I'm on the appropriations committee. So I've been, yeah, about 100, but I'll start with the Wyoming Energy Authority. And I'm just wondering to what extent you're working with them, because I know we, with the ARPA money, we gave them $100 million to do research on multiple energy sources, but the assumption is most of it's gonna go to CCUS, which is not my preference. But I'm really curious to hear what your relationship with them is.
Actually, I don't know if you want to touch on that eventually. Yeah, we work pretty closely with Wyoming Energy Authority, with Glenn and Garcia and others. We have a really good collaborative relationship with them. Some of that has been relationships at the lab that go back literally decades, when working with Representative Burkhardt and others. And so, so those relationships have been lab relationships. At one time, the University of Wyoming was a member of an institution at INL called the Center for Advanced Energy Studies. They no longer are a member of that, but some of these relationships go back that far. So an extensive relationship with them, with the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources, the Wyoming Business Council as well. So the lab's been pretty involved with them, where there's a resource for the Wyoming Energy Authority, for anybody else in Wyoming. We're not there necessarily selling a product or pushing it, and we're there to be a resource for the state of Wyoming. So that would be my quick answer.
So the follow-up would be, I think I can be loud enough, okay. The follow-up is, I mean, we're so focused on coal. I mean, that's the bottom line, and it's not really about anything besides the revenue. And I'm just curious if you have a sense that they are really interested in nuclear. I mean, we kept, putting the camera plant aside, taking a bigger look at
Without it, and from my opinion, as one of the people who works with them, absolutely. I think we've had extensive relationships with them. I believe they're looking at a broad range of energy technologies, ways to address the energy future. But I would say to you, Representative, our posture has been Wyoming will determine its own energy future. We're here to help the state of Wyoming in any way we can as they move forward with an energy future. But as far as discussions with the Wyoming Energy Authority, absolutely, we've had good discussions with them.
Great. Well, they'll be testifying before the committee next week.
Great. Glad we'll do it right now.
So I want to thank you guys for coming. This is awesome. It's really good to hear about this. Well, 35 years ago, I was in college and I got a Department of Energy fellowship in nuclear engineering. And I was working at the test site for 5 years on the Yucca Mountain plant project, which was so cool, and it didn't go through. There was so much political opposition, and what the gentleman here says is, nuclear power generates such a small amount of waste compared to all other energy sources, and yet, we couldn't, as a nation, create a nuclear waste repository to put this stuff in. I think at that time Sweden had, I think they were putting it in solid copper casks or something. I'm so out of the field now, I work in IT. But, the nuclear Yucca Mountain, I mean, they were so extravagant as to go to decide 10,000 years. We have to protect this from people for 10,000 years, and we don't even know civilization will be here. They even had scenarios where aliens came down and started digging the stuff up because it was valuable, right? That's how crazy the regulations are and why it costs so much money to get this stuff up and running, right? So my question after all that, but that's all good to get off. My question is, ultimately we can't store it in, swimming pools or dry cask storage at the nuclear plants. They aren't running out of room, but there's an awful lot of waste there. I mean, they have to replace the fuel rods every 2 years or whatever. I imagine pressurized reactors is all we have in our fleet anyway. I don't know what about China. But someday, they're gonna have to find a place to put all this, or they're gonna have to reprocess it. We had a president that, you know, in the past said, no, we're not gonna reprocess fuel, nuclear proliferation, blah, blah, blah. You know, maybe if that's the answer, I don't know. You guys are like, you have your fingers on the pulse. What are your feelings about ultimately getting this stuff in some safe place? And how that would happen so that it can, you know, alleviate all the fears that the public have about, you know, their nose blowing red like, you know, Rudolph. So that's my question. Thank you.
Sure, so I'll take a first shot at that. So just in reference to Yucca Mountain, yes, it is. For political reasons, it did not move forward. The NRC did do a technical review, and again, our regulator is a very strong, very thorough, independent regulator in the nuclear industry, and so, and then some would say over the top, but still, you know, in your case, they did review the application and basically said, technically, we believe that it would be safe and we could do this. Politically, that hasn't happened, unfortunately. The Department of Energy realizes sort of the failure with Yucca Mountain, and it actually has just restarted an effort to cite additional facilities. They've just restarted what they're calling the consent-based siting approach. And what that's doing, for the department's doing right now, is looking for a way to define a process that includes the local, regional, and state stakeholders into the process so they can understand how do you really get consent from those parties, because with Yucca, your local Nye County was very supportive, but the state was not. How do you develop and establish what consent is, and how do you maintain consent for one of these facilities over the life of the licensing timeline, the life of the facility? That's really what the problem we got. It took a long time, and there was really a lack of consent. So DOE just has sort of restarted that process. They actually have a funding opportunity announcement that it was out. I don't believe it's closed yet, but they're interested in parties reaching out and engaging with the department, and there'll be funding available for those parties to try to define what consent might look like to help hopefully find a site in the future. Now, having said that, the spent fuel that we have stored across the country is being safely managed. From a technical perspective, again, I'm an engineer at heart. I do not believe we have a technical reason that we cannot continue to maintain spent nuclear fuel in storage for decades, if not centuries, by safely protecting the public. I mean, again, there's going to be an expense with that process, but from a technical and engineering perspective, we have a very credible solution that we have been using for decades. And then maybe I'll just shift to the last point, which was the recycling piece. We at INL are looking at recycling of spent fuel. In fact, some of those sources of high assay low enriched uranium are from previous reactors that we are recovering that uranium from those reactors for use in advanced reactors. So the technology can be used, but at a high level in the country, reprocessing has not been a win from an economic perspective. But in small certain areas, it may make a lot of sense. Just like some of these small reactors makes a lot of sense in certain environments. So hopefully I answered most of your questions. I don't know if Todd or Ashley want to add in there.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of things, but first I have to notice you were picking on aliens and they're not here to defend themselves. So just to be there, yeah. The other things I think I point out two other things. Josh mentioned consent-based siting. Both Finland and Sweden have a repository, right? The difference really wasn't process, right? Whereas the US sort of made a top-down congressional decision to pick the Yucca Mountain site, which then got the state of Nevada upset because they felt they didn't have a voice in that. Finland and Sweden used a consent-based process. The details of the two of them were very different, but there were some common elements, as in communities had to sign up to be part of the study. You got reimbursed when you're in the study. You could always be taken out of the study if the geology of your area didn't work, or you could always take yourself out of the site if you decided as a community you weren't interested. But in the end, the details were different, but they both came to a solution, right? So I can point to a place. two countries in the world who have demonstrated you can build a repository. And so I think that's it. The other thing I'll just point out that may or may not be obvious is when we talk about nuclear waste, right, we're really talking about the fuel. There's all sorts of radiological materials that we dispose of right now, right? Things that come out of hospitals, right? We dispose of that. So disposing of radioactive materials and transporting around it happens all the time, right? So we're really talking about a very small class of fuels that Josh mentioned, right? So two other things I there.
Thank you.
Thanks, Todd. Any other questions?
One of the things that whenever I read about, what did it say? Successful site and projects is the issue of a 10-year timeline. Let's say to decide you're going to build, and even though there's basic designs versus, you know, a simple, let's say natural gas peaking plant. And the fact that utilities cannot charge their client base any monies until that plant produces any electricity. Do you see that as an issue, and do you see any solution or those things being discussed? I think there are regulatory requirements in individual states.
Correct. It's unique. So there are some places in the country where you are allowed to charge your customers during construction. It's a state level policy decision. So I was talking earlier that there are policy decisions that we can make that will help determine the pathways for some of these energy technologies. That just happened to be one of them. That is a lot, right? So you can do that, and there have been places in the US that do that. I think Vogel does. Yeah, Vogel is we're building two of the large light water reactors in the state of Georgia. It's called the Vogel site. Yeah, they got permission from their state public utility commission, whatever it's called, right, to charge the customer base during construction. So it's possible, right? But it's a decision that policymakers have to decide, right? Because there's a risk if you don't finish the plant, right? Then you did ask the ratepayers to fund something that they didn't get a benefit for the end. So it's policy decision.
And the next, it seems that Utah, I guess with UAMs, seems to be progressive. Do you see that state as progressive, or what state do you think has good policies that enable good projects?
Yes, I actually think there's lots of states that are moving policy decisions to be supportive, right? So start with the current existing reactors. A number of states, Illinois, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, made a decision, right, to provide financial support to existing light water reactors, commercial plants, for their zero carbon value, right? And this has all happened within the, say, the past 5-ish years, right? So there's states who used to have renewable portfolio standards, said we want a certain amount of renewable, have changed the language to clean or zero carbon, right? Which now, in a policy sense, helps the nuclear. Okay? You know, even California, which you never would have associated with a pro-nuclear decision, they look at their climate goals, they look at the progress they're making, and they decided they needed to slow down the termination of their last nuclear plant. Right? So I would say there are lots of states that are coming to the conclusion, or they're looking at this, that are making decisions that are supporting the existing plants. And then I think with newer plants, you'll see it in the state of Wyoming, the state of Washington, right, who are being very supportive of the first demos in their states in various places. But it can be very different, right? Because there's lots of policy levers you can use: tax breaks, guaranteed purchases, all sorts of things.
The state of Idaho is going through a process right now too, looking at how to make sure some of their laws. I'm looking at my colleague, the Nuclear Energy Institute has something on their website, right? That details what each of the states are doing. And so you can have states that have had moratoriums on nuclear, they're lifting those moratoriums. So if you, NEI's website, NEI.org, will be research, break down state by state actions.
What was that?
And so Nuclear Energy Institute, so NEI.org. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? The back.
I have two questions. So one that you touched on, for a second, fusion, the future of fusion as an energy source. And the other one, and maybe I misunderstood, actually you were talking about the new generation of reactors. And if I understood correctly, you were talking about ramping up and down the utilization. I thought that was interesting versus running at base load. Why would we want to ramp a nuclear reactor up and down? Great, that's a great question. I'll start with that question if that's okay. You know, ideally in a vacuum, you wouldn't, because it's a high capital cost asset with low fuel costs. So you want to run it up all the time. But what happens with today's markets is that sometimes you might have a lot of wind capacity and it's really windy. And so now you have a lot of wind that has to come on the grid. And so you need to ramp down the nuclear, and that gets reflected in the prices. So in the Midwest, there are nuclear plants that have to pay money to put their power on the grid because there's so much wind at a given time. So being able to ramp down is a positive there. In France, there's so much nuclear that they need to ramp their fleet with the changing demand of electricity throughout the day. So they ramp their fleet up and down about 50% often. So that can be a reason, but realistically, well, we may see ramping and we will see some ramping, but I think we're also going to see a move towards alternative uses of the nuclear energy. I think it's likely that we're going to see cases where instead of ramping your nuclear plant, you say, okay, well, my nuclear plant is going to run and it's going to make heat, and I'm going to put as much heat into electricity as the power grid wants, you know, given the prices and everything. And then I'm going to take what's left and put it into storage or put it into hydrogen production or something else that can arbitrage the prices of electricity. So if you're making hydrogen for fuel for vehicles, you can make that while the wind's blowing heavy. And that might be a smarter way to work the nuclear plant, but ramping is a short-term option. And then what was the other question?
Fusion.
Fusion, right, go ahead.
Yeah, so just to answer the question at the right sort of level. I mean, do you understand the difference between the two to start out with? Okay, so I think the real difference, right, is that fission, the types of reactors we've been talking about, we have successfully gone from translating a fission, a release of energy, into productive power. We make electricity. We've gone through all those steps, right? The analogy I'll use is fusion is still closer to the discovering what fission is, right? They're trying to still prove that they can keep fusing atoms together, right, at a steady state so that they can get energy out, right? Once they prove that, they still have to go through all the steps of how do I usefully extract the energy and turn it into electricity or heat or something else. And because fusion is just a harder problem than fission, right? It lags in sort of the practical engineering associated. Now, that said, there's a lot of private money going into fusion, right? I think some of the fusion companies are pretty smart about doing things on the way to fusion that make money, right? In the hopes of getting there. I'll use it as an example. There's a company in Wisconsin called Shine. If you've heard of them, it's because they're making medical isotopes, right? But at their core, they're using a fusion reaction to generate neutrons to then make medical isotopes. If you listen to their strategic story, they want to do fusion, but they're smart enough to know if they first use their fusion device to make isotopes, they can start making money at an intermediate step and then move on, right? So part of the reason I think, well, two things. Part of the reason I think there's a lot of private money in fusion is some of them are being smart about the way they stage. The other is, I think there's a lot of crazy people that see other people spending money and they just start investing. You can pick which.
There's an opposite side. The Department of Energy has recently put out a program where they're funding companies to work to demonstrate fusion. But what they're demonstrating is not fusion electricity, it is net energy from fusion, targeting the early 2030s, if I remember correctly. And it's $50 million, so it's just a start, and it's a really good, it's a promising start. It's a demonstration that the efforts around fusion are moving from a science project to being an effort towards getting useful energy. But we're still a ways off before you even get net energy out, because you put a lot of energy into a fusion reactor to try to make plasma happen and to try to make fusion happen. And right now we put in more energy to make that fusion happen than we get out of the fusion reaction. So hopefully early 2030s, we'll see that net energy, and then we'll have all the engineering to do.
Did you say you could get hydrogen from the nuclear, elemental hydrogen from the nuclear reactor?
Well, you can get hydrogen, but what you do is something like use the heat or the electricity to split water. Right? So you're still, just like any other hydrogen production, well, you can split water or you can crack methane, right? But typically what we would do is we would use the energy from the nuclear plant either to make electricity and then do electrolysis, or to use a high temperature electrolysis, but you're essentially splitting water. Right? But the advantage, the reason why people talk about nuclear hydrogen is that you're separating the hydrogen, making it available as an energy carrier with something that does not generate CO2. Whereas if you use like steam methane reforming, you're using natural gas, and therefore you're releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Does that make sense?
You mentioned early on that the next generation nuclear can use a variety of different coolants. I'm wondering if you can briefly address the pros and cons of those for water.
Sure, I can start with that. The biggest, I mean, Todd, you served on a submarine. Water works great when you're surrounded by water. And the reason we have water-cooled reactors is because Admiral Rickover decided that water-cooled reactors made a lot of sense in a submarine that was surrounded by a heat sink of water, and that was right. On land, it's not surrounded by water, and water boils. And so much of what we're trying to do in today's reactors is make sure that that water doesn't boil off. I mean, boil water to make steam, to make electricity, but you need to be able to cool the core, and that's done with water, not steam. So most of these advanced coolants don't boil at any temperature that you're likely to see in a nuclear power plant, even on the worst postulated day. And I think that there are other aspects, efficiencies and things that are great, and being able to reach higher temperatures for other products. But the biggest reason, from my perspective, and the other panelists might disagree, to go with these other coolants is that you can eliminate the risk of boiling the coolant. And now you have a situation where you don't need active systems to maintain cooling. So you can lose offsite power, you can lose your pumps, you can walk away. You would never do that, but you could walk away in theory, and your sodium or your lead, it wouldn't boil, it would maintain cooling. So I think that's the biggest reason to look at other coolants. What do others want to add?
Yeah, just as an example, this gets to something Josh said about the Idaho National Lab advancing certain ideas. People have forgotten this, but right around the same time as the 3 Mile Island accident, right, or soon after, the Idaho National Lab ran an experiment on a sodium cooled reactor. Think of it as like a cousin to Natrium. And they basically said, let's run the same accident sequence that caused the failure of 3 Mile Island, right? And they just turned off the pumps in one case that run coolant through the reactor. It's a sodium cooled reactor. In another case, they disconnected the heat sink, the thing that was removing heat from the sodium, and just watched it. And it just goes down through them, right? I think because this was right around the same time as 3 Mile Island, people never figured it out, right? But it's a really good combination of Ashley's point, right, about ability to remove heat, Josh's point about the lab being a place that demonstrates things like this, proof of concept.
Maybe the only thing I'd add there is I think the safety aspects of these advanced reactors really is amazing. And I think, again, we've demonstrated some of these reactors. I hate to use the terminology walk away, but right, we basically turned off, we stopped doing anything, any human interaction, and demonstrated that the reactor safely shut down without any issues. And so I think there's something, the safety is one aspect. I will say, when you start looking at the safety, but there's also more efficient ways to generate electricity and some of these other things by using other materials that may have higher heat transfer or can go to higher temperatures. And so there's some efficiency benefits along with the safety. I think the safety is probably the number one priority, but again, there's some benefits there too.
Yeah, we can go back to the Dow example, right? Dow wants high temperature heat. So you want to be able to go as high temperature with your reactor as you can. So you want a coolant that allows you to go to high temperature. Just a better reactor for that specific business case.
Are there any cons to any of them?
Yeah, so there are, right? So with sodium, right? Anyone who's done a high school chemistry experiment knows that if you put sodium in air, it'll burn, right? So you have to be much more disciplined about making sure you don't have leaks in your piping, right? There was a reactor in Japan that had a leak early on and never really recovered from. Right. On the other hand, the EBR2 reactor in Idaho ran for 30 years quite well. Right. So it's something that you can engineer around, right? But it's different, right? And it's something that is more complicated to work with than water. But you learn to do that and figure out how to balance the pros and cons.
And just some other simple things, it's opaque, so you can't see through it, you have to have a different way of looking at parts. And liquid lead is corrosive, so with each of these, you have things to balance.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was a coincidence, Todd, but it was too loud just while you're speaking.
Yeah, well, I think once I called him on the whole alien thing, he started to bubble inside and eventually it was either leave or hit me. Yeah.
So it's helpful. When people ask about water, I think two aspects of nuclear power plants. When you look at them, like the old ones that I visited, they have massive cooling ponds. I mean, it's just like huge lakes. And we don't have that water in a lot of different locations. So it's just not a feasible thing to do to say, oh, I'm gonna have a nuclear power plant, but I've got to have 20 acres of water. And then, but correct me if I'm wrong, that still when you're gonna make electricity, you have a closed water steam loop. And it's gonna stay internal and hopefully, there's not much leakage. So they all use water for the turbine to produce steam, is that correct? But it's a closed sealed system. And so it won't be a big water user, which is kind of the Natrium selling point is limited water, not gonna have the big ponds. So is that a helpful comment?
So I'd love to hear from each of you, kind of walk us through what you think from a practical standpoint, the nuclear power industry will look like in terms of generating electricity in the US, kind of over the next, 5, 10, 20 years, what in terms of the percentage of the mix, or how do you think it, and obviously there are going to be challenges and such, and something will, this is starting. But realistically, how do you see it?
I can start, right? I'm a professor, so I'm allowed to say stuff, right? So, so I think the context for this is I think we're going to continue to add a lot of renewables, right? It seems like we've added a lot, but compared to how much energy we actually use, we've barely started. Right? I view where we are with renewables now, kind of where we were with nuclear in the 1960s. We're on the takeoff, and we're going to find out how much we can do. But I think we're going to build a lot. I think the answer to your question is very regionally dependent, right? If you're in a place that's got a lot of hydro, right? That's very different than a place that's got a lot of wind, than a place that has neither, right? So you're going to see differences in region. If I take the long view, I think you're going to see nuclear continue to show up as electricity production, but in different ways. I don't think it's all going to be large plants that feed the grid. You may have single companies, server farm that want dedicated power, right? Things like this. So I think you're going to see a variety of sizes that are still aimed at electricity. And then I think you will have reactors that are more targeted towards industry, high temperature heat, dedicated hydrogen, something like that. So I said there's maybe 50-some companies out there, maybe half of them are fission. I think we end up with maybe 2 or 3 product lines, right? And hopefully the best technology comes out of those. But so big electricity, smaller electricity, dedicated industrial heat, something like that. And I think in the short term, as Ashley pointed out, we're building demos. There's a lot of companies that are going to build the demo, you can build it, you can operate it, you can drive the cost down. Right. So I think we're in the build the demos phase now, next 5-ish years. Then you move into, do people like the demos? Do you start to move into commercial products and then go from there? It's kind of like beta max versus VCRs, right? We're in that, there's lots of ideas. We'll see which ones do the best job.
I think I'll, generally what Todd says makes sense. I think we'll see some microreactor applications, very small reactors that have some really interesting opportunities to meet real needs in certain applications. So you mentioned data centers. I think there are also remote energy needs that will be met by microreactors. I think there are some industrial needs. If we have a drive towards decarbonization, we'll see the big industrials who need to have reliable, firm, low carbon energy turn to nuclear as the source for that in some cases. But I think the US is a little bit unpredictable because we can afford to make energy choices in whatever way we want. It's not, if you do the modeling, if you look at academia and the modeling that's done, when you try to do deep decarbonization, try to get to zero, it's clear that including nuclear or carbon capture or some other low carbon, high, availability energy source reduces the cost of deep decarbonization. So I think that in places where energy choices are made based on cost, we will see more nuclear, and some of that will be global. So we're going to see countries that can't afford to be picky about which low carbon energy source they have. They're going to choose nuclear because it's going to be available, it's going to meet their needs, and it's going to be the best choice to meet their needs in some cases. What we do is I think more unpredictable because our market is so strange, and every state is different, so it'll be regional.
Yeah, I'll maybe just I will just agree with, it's not one market, we have just so many different regional markets. But one thing I will note is, we talked about there's 2 large plants being built right now, hoping to finish up next year. I do not believe that we'll probably see any of these big, large baseload plants, at least for the next decade or so, based on the experience that we've seen from those. So I think inevitably smaller is the future. How many, what size, what smaller means, I think is going to be, sort of different depending on the application. But I think you said 5-10 years. I do not expect any large plants, and maybe 20 years. We'll see, what's changed since then. But in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see a lot of demonstrations, a lot of smaller pieces, a lot of very targeted applications for, a location that, can't get diesel to them, but 2 months a year. And so they need something they can count on all the time, that sort of application. I don't have a very clear crystal ball, besides sort of maybe the next 5 years we may be able to predict, but longer term it's very hard in this country to predict sort of 20 years down the road.
The two big areas to watch, I think, are the retiring coal plants and the retiring nuclear plants. Both of those are going to be large losses of generation, which will need to be replaced with something. And right now, as nuclear plants retire, we see them replaced with gas. But hopefully that won't be the case for all of them, where we're going to have a pitfall. So I think those are 2 places to watch, and hopefully, we're certainly seeing nuclear companies and labs and others work to prepare products that will be suitable for those markets, but we'll see how that pans out.
Yeah, I think the one other thing that's a big determinant in this is, can the US figure out how to do large cross-state electricity transmission projects, right? If that gets easier somehow, right, then you can move power from place to place. That may change how all this plays out, but right now that's super hard, right? It's just super hard to do big cross-state infrastructure projects like transmission lines. That may drive you to more smaller distributed systems. We'll see.
Any other questions?
So if you're going to have proliferation of a variety of, micro plants, in a variety of different places, using different technologies, how's the Nuclear Regulatory Commission gonna see the engine at?
Yeah, so in the end, I don't think you'll end up with a gazillion different micro reactor vendors, right? I think you'll end up with micro reactors, and one of these vendors will come up with the best solution. And I think, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has a long history of regulating one thing, right? And they are, admitted, self-admittedly, in a process of training staff, trying to decide do their processes make sense, given these are different technologies, right? And they don't operate the same, and the regulatory approach should be different, right? So I think they're moving in that direction. I think Congress is starting to figure out that we've got a way of paying the NRC that is anti-innovation, right? They get most of their fees from existing companies, right? So if you were running a big nuclear plant, would you be super happy if they took all your fees and spent most of it developing Josh's new product? Probably not, right? So it's a weird regulatory approach. I think the country and the government sort of recognize this and are working towards it. And I think that the NRC will figure this out, right? I personally think I don't worry about the technologists driving to better technology solutions. We're good at that. The regulator may not be there yet, but we're used to working with the regulator, right? I personally, this is why we do the research we do. I want to think more about the social issues. What drives people to want things, not want them, and specific technologies. And I think that's not a nuclear question. That's a nuclear question. It's a utility scale wind farm question. It's a transmission question.
On the regulator, I would just add, if your concern is about whether they can handle this many different things, while today's reactors are all water cooled, they're almost all different. So they're regulating 100 different nuclear power plants right now. And in the vision that Todd has laid out, we have a few vendors, so really just a few products, and there are many of them, but it could actually be a much simpler regulatory regime than we have now. And they're well staffed. They did staff up for the nuclear renaissance of the early 2000s that did not really occur. So I think, from that perspective, they're in a good position.
Okay, well, I think we'll wrap up here. I want to thank Ashley, Todd, and Josh for being with us here today. Leah, I want to thank you and the library. You guys have a beautiful facility here, so we're very impressed. But thank all of you for coming out and spending some time with us today and learn about the future of nuclear energy. But one thing I would say in closing is, I know National Laboratory is right over the pass down the hill. It's one of the nation's 17 national laboratories. We employ about 5,700 people with an annual budget of in excess of $1.6 billion right now. While it's called INL National Laboratory, it's a national asset. We hope it's an asset for the Western United States, and we hope it's an asset for Wyoming, for all of you. So I would encourage you, I will leave my cards here tonight, but this doesn't have to be the end of this dialogue. We'll be more than comfortable or happy to talk to any of you as a follow-up to this discussion. Please get a hold of me. Like I said, I'll leave some cards, and I can get you in contact with anybody, including Todd, as well as actually Josh. So thank you, everyone. Really appreciate the dialogue.